Welcome to the Sterning HR podcast, your ultimate destination for all things HR and professional career development. I'm your host, Bianca Clifton, and I'm thrilled to have you with us. At Sterning HR, we take immense pride in being a specialist HR recruitment and coaching organisation. Our mission is to provide valuable insights and engaging discussions with some of the most impressive HR leaders in the industry. So whether you're a HR professional seeking to enhance your knowledge or someone looking to unlock the full potential of their career, you've come to the right place. In each episode, we dive into the world of human resources. We explore the latest trends, innovative strategies, and game-changing practices that are shaping the workplace of today and tomorrow. Our focus on empowering women is close to our hearts. We believe that every woman deserves to get what she wants and be valued for her true worth. Together, we strive to create an environment where women can thrive, flourish, and confidently pursue their ambitions without having to sacrifice their family life. Thank you for tuning into the Sterning HR podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and stay connected with us for exciting episodes to come.
Hi, Melody. Thanks for joining me again for the episode or part 2 of our series on absenteeism and wellbeing.
Thanks, Bianca. Nice to do part 2 with you.
Now, for those who have or haven't listened to the first part of this series, I'll just give a quick recap around what we covered off, and then we'll jump into part 2, what we're going to discuss today. So in part 1, we discussed the impacts of absenteeism and wellbeing in the workplace, the challenges faced by HR leaders in managing absenteeism and promoting wellbeing, understanding how absenteeism and employee relations are nearly always linked, the main causes of absenteeism, the trends and the patterns that are generally observed, and then how absenteeism impacts wellbeing, organisational culture, and therefore organisational performance. So in this episode today, Melody and I will cover off how to implement a wellbeing program, how to tailor an effective return to work program, how can organisations utilise flexible work arrangements as part of their wellbeing strategy, and then what else to consider when developing a wellbeing program. So just firstly, I guess we'll just jump in. Melody, how does a company go about implementing a comprehensive wellbeing plan? Because I know that there's obviously many layers that need to get addressed.
Yeah, I think my sort of key message first up is that it doesn't need to be fancy. I think at the moment, the wellbeing industry within workplaces, within businesses, it's grown so significantly. People see that there's potentially big money in wellbeing, but ultimately what you're doing with respect to helping your workforce be well, safe, it doesn't need to be fancy. You can go back to basics. Part of, I think, what is critical in developing your wellbeing program is making sure that you've got genuine commitment from your leadership that will help drive whatever it is that you're doing. Part of the challenge that we might have in HR is actually gaining that buy-in, helping to quantify or build understanding within your leadership team around why wellbeing is important. So I guess a couple of things, and maybe just to put into context what we're managing at the moment in this space. I think where historically we've maybe looked at wellbeing programs or wellbeing initiatives as sort of a perk or a nice to have, things have really shifted over the last few years, and even just in the language in terms of how we refer to wellbeing at work. And more recently, certainly businesses are hearing more and more about the need to manage psychosocial risks within their workplaces. And I think that might be a really great starting point in terms of speaking to leadership and gaining a level of buy-in or understanding around why is wellbeing of the workforce important. So firstly, it's not a nice to have anymore. It's a must have. if we're just looking at it from a risk and compliance perspective. So we've seen codes of practice come out in terms of managing psychosocial risk within workplaces. And psychosocial risk speaks to the things within your workplace that have potential to cause psychological injury, illness, or harm.
And what might some of them be, as an example?
So there's different frameworks that speak about psychosocial risk in the workplace. Primarily, when we're looking at what might drive psychosocial risk, we'd be looking at things like work design, job demands, job resources, organizational justice, exposure to might be inappropriate conduct or traumatic events at work. So I think about industries like residential care, aged care, retail, hospitality. You think about the sorts of things that workers in those industries might be exposed to. Occupational violence has become a big area of focus for a lot of our clients, given the nature of the work that their employees do. What I know, at least from my experience, is that oftentimes where I'm speaking with a client or a manager that's dealing with an absenteeism issue at work, when we start to dig into what the reasons for that might be, we start to identify issues with respect to psychosocial risk factors within the workplace. So that starting point, the psychosocial risk assessment and understanding the nature of the work that your workers are performing and the resources they actually have to do their jobs is a great sort of starting point to get a view on what you might need to be doing.
And I think we kind of spoke about off air earlier, just in terms of the cost of psychosocial risk, in terms of cases not being growing exponentially, and the cost to organisations as well. So if organisations don't get this right or don't spend the time in terms of doing that initial assessment, the cost to them is quite significant.
Yeah. So over the last few years, particularly since COVID, but even pre-COVID, workers' comp insurers, the regulators in the workers' compensation space had started to release some of the data around psychological illness and injury claims that they were seeing. And what we know is that there's been one significant growth in the number of claims relating to psychological illness or injury that have been sustained at work or in the course of employment. But the second part of that is what we know. Those sorts of claims typically cost significantly more than physical injury claims, and they also result in an employee spending a lot more time out of the workforce or out of the workplace. So it takes longer to get that employee back to work, and ultimately what that ends up in is a higher claims cost for that injury or illness that's been sustained. So that's, I think, a challenge that the insurers have recognised. It's a challenge that the regulators have recognised. There have been recent changes announced, proposed changes, and changes that are in fact going ahead in Victoria, for example, around psychological injury claims in the workers' comp space in Victoria. And that's directly as a result of such a huge increase in those claims. Even to make another point as well, even if the claim or even if the case doesn't result in a workers' compensation case, non-work related injury and illness that might be impacted by psychosocial risk factors within the workforce can have the same effect in terms of cost, in terms of impact.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be a return to work claim. It can be people having long periods of time away from work, the extra work that their team members are having to do as well, mental health issues. It's significant. So, okay, so you think initially in terms of kind of the first step that you do prior to implementing this wellbeing program is to do this psychosocial risk assessment, understand, like you said, what those kind of the specifics are of each of those kind of job positions, kind of the job design and what employees are exposed to. And then once you've kind of got a good idea around the different types of scenarios you've got in your business, then you can, I guess that's the first step that you need to do to implement this wellbeing program.
Yeah. And I think conducting the psychosocial risk assessment, going through that process. So firstly, in terms of building the case around the need to do that one, we've talked about risk and compliance, and we know that from a health and safety duty perspective, it's a way to be able to demonstrate that as a business, you're taking all reasonably practicable steps to eliminate or minimize psychosocial risk to health and safety in your workplace. So if that's a conversation that you're having with your leadership, that's a good starting point. Secondly, we've spoken before as well about the kind of softer aspects of why managing wellbeing or these issues is important from an engagement, retention perspective. Absolutely has an impact on that. So we've had that conversation. You might start with that psychosocial risk assessment, knowing that it's a requirement from a risk and compliance perspective. But then the data that you get out of that process is so important, because there's a number of ways that you might conduct a psychosocial risk assessment. We're seeing a lot of our clients go out and actually survey their workers or conduct focus groups with their workers to gather information directly from those people around what things might be going on, what issues might they be dealing with, or hazards might they be exposed to that have potential to cause mental harm. All of that feeds back into what you might need to implement from a controls perspective and what would actually look to form your wellbeing strategy.
Yeah, perfect. And that was, really well articulated.
Thank you.
All right. So in terms of if a HR leader was looking to tackle like an identified absenteeism issue, what would a tailored strategy look like?
Yeah. So once you've identified that you've got an issue with respect to absenteeism, usually the first things that I would do was sort of go right back to basics in terms of what's our framework for managing non-work related injury and illness or extended absences due to sick leave. So when you go back to basics, that might look like looking at things around your policies. Have you got documented and clear policies and processes, both for your employees to understand what support might be available to them, what actually happens when they need to take time off work, perhaps due to a chronic illness or an injury that they've sustained, and then also for managers to understand what are they actually required to do, what are their responsibilities with respect to supporting, but also managing a recurring absenteeism issue or a period of time that someone needs off work because of something that might be affecting their health or their well-being. So that would be the starting point, looking at the framework that you've got in place. Have you got your policy? Have you got your process? And then to fit nicely and make sure, I guess, that framework is actually operating to give you an effective resource, you need to make sure your managers are trained in that framework, that they understand what's required. That's right. That's right. So a lot of businesses that I know or that I've worked with in the past or that I know do injury management really well, they've got really great processes in place and structure and support whole teams, in fact, that would take care of things like workers' compensation, injuries and illnesses. And they know how to do that really, really well. But when it comes to something that's not a workers' comp issue, I think sometimes businesses are sort of like, well, what do we do now with this? How do we manage this? So that's where, at least in my experience, what I've seen is that oftentimes non-work related injury and illness or absenteeism cases and issues can actually be higher in volume than your workers' comp claims. And so making sure, I guess, that you've looked at both how you're managing your workers' comp claims, and then potentially you can apply some of or the same processes around that.
Mm.
To managing non-work related illness and injury. So that's looking at things like what leave and support is available, how do we actually maintain contact and communication with that worker while they're off work or while we're managing this absenteeism issue. How are we maintaining obtaining relevant medical information from the employee if we need that before we understand if they're actually fit to come back to work. Are there any things that we need to be doing to check from a duty of care perspective if there's adjustments or accommodations that person might need when they're back at work? I find that continuous monitoring and communication that you've got in place with a particular worker that's having an absenteeism issue, that's absolutely critical to being actually able to get the person to stay at work. So that's sort of the first thing, going back to basics, making sure you've got that framework in place, potentially applying some of the same strategies that you're using in the workers' comp side to your non-work related injury and illness. And part of that is looking at, do you actually have structured return to work plans or return to work programs in place for managing recurring absence? So again, in that some of the listeners might be really familiar with this from a workers' comp perspective, having a return to work plan. Oftentimes I'll apply that same approach or that same strategy for someone that's having recurring absences due to sick leave as a stay at work plan. So we actually assess and make sure that this person can do the job that we've engaged them to do and do that safely and within any medical restrictions or capacity issues that they might have. And then again, having that ongoing review and monitoring to make sure that this is actually working. So if we're starting to see the absence go back up or we're starting to see those recurring absences happen again, revisiting that in a safe way. So if you've established that program or that ongoing communication channel with that worker, it makes it natural for you to be able to have that conversation to say, hey, I've noticed that these absences have picked back up again. Let's review what we've got in place. Is this actually working and helping you stay at work?
And in your experience, what has been, in terms of that communication piece and that ongoing, I guess that ongoing dialogue, obviously there's a place for HR to be running it from a compliance and a legal perspective as well. But when there's also a manager who's involved in this. So from your experience, where have you seen it work really well? Has it been solely kind of fallen on the shoulders of HR or on the manager, or thinking obviously you're going to say it's a combined approach, but then in terms of that, how can that be done successfully, or how have you seen that executed successfully to reduce this long-term absenteeism issue with a particular employee?
I think the manager is the line manager is absolutely critical to the success of one, being able to tackle the issue, have a conversation with an employee and put a support process in place to manage what's going on. But also from an ongoing welfare, well-being perspective, the line manager is the one that's the eyes and ears on the ground and that has contact with the worker, that sees what the performance is looking like, that sees potential red flags with respect to well-being or mental health. So I think the manager is absolutely critical.
And how would you suggest the best process for them to follow to ensure that success?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's worked really well for me in the past is being an internal ER or HR support function, not necessarily getting involved first up straight away to be there in front of the employee from the beginning. So providing coaching, guidance and support for the manager along the way while they're dealing with this issue is really important, helping set them up for success so they understand what steps are we needing to take? What responsibility or role do they play in this process in terms of that monitoring and regularity of review of how things are working, and them actually knowing when to escalate to get more support from HR, or to ask someone to provide some additional support or guidance. Whether that's speaking with the employee separately as a third party or being involved in those conversations. In terms of steps in the process, it really depends on what the actual issue is as to what kind of process you would want to undertake. But typically speaking, right at the beginning for an absenteeism issue, what I'm telling managers is 3 fundamental steps that you want to put in place. So the first is making sure you've set expectations really clearly with the employee about what's required from a notice and evidence perspective when someone's taking personal leave. So most managers will have an understanding with their employees about, if you're going to be unwell, these are the steps that I need you to follow to take a day of personal leave. But sometimes other people just haven't had that conversation up front and made it really clear. And it sounds like a common sense thing, like people would know what they need to do when they're calling in sick. But I say, again, just going right back to basics, set the expectation with your team as a manager about how you... Say that again. Sorry.
Don't assume.
Yeah, don't assume. Absolutely. Set the expectation. And sometimes, particularly if someone's been there for a while, they may have just gotten in the groove of doing something in a particular way, like sending a text message to say, hey, Mel, I'm not feeling well today. I'm not going to come in. So I say set the expectation really clearly about how you want people to notify you, and if evidence is required when someone's taking personal leave. And you might have that already established in your policies or your processes. So you might go back to those documents and refer back to those, make people aware of them. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Really important when someone is on a recurring basis calling in sick for sort of 1 day, 2 days here and there. As long as we've set that framework in place around, this is how I want you to notify. I need you to call me before the start of your shift. It needs to be a phone call. I often say I prefer a phone call as opposed to text messages, because it means I can check in with that employee and actually make sure that they're okay. And I've had instances in the past where, for example, an employee was experiencing family and domestic violence. And part of the safety planning for that particular employee was that if they weren't going to come in to work because of personal leave or carer's leave, whatever it might be, that we actually had a phone call and we knew that it was that employee that we were speaking to. We had a duty of care to sort of make sure that we'd spoken to them and checked in with respect to their welfare.
Yeah.
So that's the first piece. The second part of the process that I'd suggest to managers is making sure that when a person comes back to work after sick leave, after a period of sick leave, whether it's 1 day, whether it's a week, that you're doing a return to work check-in.
Yeah.
So for some people, it might be a structured kind of sit down, particularly for when someone suffered from an injury, so they've broken a leg or sprained an ankle, or something like that has happened and it's their first return to work after an extended period of absence. For others, it might just be 1 day here and there, but starting to get into the practice of when someone comes back from that period of leave, actually having a check-in with them. So whether it's picking up the phone or sitting down quickly and asking them, how are you? Are you okay? Are you well enough to be back at work today? I think it demonstrates just that genuine care in terms of actually wanting to know how that person is and that they should be, and whether or not they should be back at work. And there have been instances in the past where managers have come back to me after starting to implement that process, and they've given me a call and said, I've done this return to work check-in, and the employee said, hey, actually, no, I shouldn't be here today. I'm not feeling well. I've come in because I, felt like I had to, or they've run out of sick leave. And that's been an opportunity for the conversation to actually open up around what's going on, what other support do we need to implement, what do you need? So I think that's gets into a really good, it gets you into a really good practice of actually taking the time to demonstrate that genuine care and also checking off your duty of care responsibility, in the sense I'm checking this person is actually okay to be back at work today, and also if there's anything else that that they might need. And for someone that's coming back after an injury, so in the broken leg example, that's the opportunity to check what else they might need in terms of adjustments to their role. So if they usually perform a role where they're required to get up and walk around, we've agreed to have them back at work on some temporarily adjusted duties. We're making sure that they understand, okay, this is what they're able to do. These are the adjustments that we've made for them. This is what they need to do if there's a concern about what they're doing, or the adjustment isn't helping them, or it's they're experiencing pain, for example, if they're performing particular tasks. Having that conversation when that person comes back to work sets you up for success in being able to manage the staying at work part. For people with the recurring absences, those short-term recurring absences, it sends a message or a signal that, hey, we're actually concerned here about your well-being, and every time you're off, we're going to be having this conversation because I need to check in. I need to make sure that you're okay, and I need to understand if there's anything else that we need to be doing to enable you to stay at work.
It puts you on the front foot of it by, I guess, having that conversation earlier, like you said, rather than it not being addressed and then the employee continuing to have those short stints of absenteeism because the underlying issue hasn't been discussed or addressed.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's really important. All right, and what about number 3?
The third thing I would typically suggest is if we're getting to a point where someone has had a significant number of absences, so if it's, some people use the 3-month rule, that's kind of coming out of the Fair Work Act, temporary absence due to illness or injury, general protections. But I usually say if someone's getting close to utilising all of the sick leave that they had accrued, they're moving into that unpaid leave territory. Or if we're seeing a pattern of recurring absences in combination with other things, so a decline in performance, change in behaviour, other things that are sort of setting up that red flag, that might be the point of escalation. So it's escalating when you need to get some more support and advice, and that might be the point in time that the manager reaches out to someone like an HR support or someone within the health and safety team to say, hey, this is the situation that I'm dealing with or that I'm managing. Are there any other things that we actually need to be doing here to help this person stay at work? And that might be looking at things like, is there a need to get more medical information about this person's ability to perform their job or be at work? Is there a point in time that we need to say, hey, actually, we've been trying to have you stay at work. We've implemented these things to support you, whether it's adjustments or accommodations, giving you a period of leave to take some time and recharge and reset, but it's not resulted in that outcome that we want. How do we need to actually change how we're dealing with this now? And that's a really important conversation to have and get some support and advice from your HR or your health and safety teams to give you some insight. So knowing when to escalate, knowing what that red flag is that pops up and tells you, hey, actually, I need to be doing something differently here. The worst thing a manager can do is to just allow what's going on to continue on without some sort of step back and review of, okay, these are the things that we've done. This is what we've attempted to try and support this employee, and it hasn't changed the result, or we're not seeing a change. What do we need to be doing differently?
And I think that also brings it back to why it's so important to initially do that psychosocial risk assessment. Because if you've got that assessment and the understanding of all the I guess just all the components of that and what it looks like in your workforce, your managers have access to that as well. So they're feeling more empowered as well, to have the visibility of, I guess, that they're doing everything that they can on their end, and then obviously they understand the framework and how it operates within that. And then when it gets to this point, like you said, then there probably needs to be an escalation instead of it kind of being muddied waters, not understanding the intricacies of how it all works or what your department looks like from that psychosocial risk assessment piece, and kind of just not dealing with it because you can't see clearly around where you're at in that process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to the point around psychosocial risk management, so a lot of businesses have recently done things like mental health first aid training, which is absolutely amazing. That kind of training in isolation without a framework around how does that actually fit in to what we expect from managers in executing on their duties from a health and safety perspective. It might be helpful in those sort of crisis point situations. It might be helpful in equipping managers in sort of seeing some of those red flags, but it's got to be part of, I guess, a wider framework that you've got in place. And that's one component of it. And I think the point that you raised around managers not sort of being there, sitting alone, wondering, what do I do, and knowing when to escalate things. I think that is so important, because often what I've seen is that managers might not be managing just that one person that's absent. They're managing a team of people. And then they might be managing the operational requirements or the business objectives that they're trying to achieve.
That's right. It's just one element of their role. Yeah.
That's right. So I think what is so absolutely critical is, one, recognizing that managers need to be supported to be able to support their employees. So if you've got managers there that are also dealing with feeling completely overburdened, stressed, under-resourced in being able to actually tackle these issues, you're going to have a really hard time in actually getting to the root of the problem and addressing the absenteeism issue. So supporting your managers to support their employees is critical. Part of what that might involve is actually building their capability to be able to identify and address psychosocial hazards themselves. So whilst they might not be the subject matter experts in health and safety management systems or conducting a psychosocial risk assessment, at least equipping managers with a level of understanding around what psychosocial risks are, the sorts of ways that they can have an impact on that for their teams. So a really easy example is, and where I've seen managers do really well in managing some of these issues, is just with respect to workloads. I think managers that I've seen that do really well and that have a team that feels safe enough to come to them and ask for more support, or identify that their manager actually genuinely cares about what it is that they're dealing with, you're more likely to get a better result in terms of the process that you're engaging in. So to the point around the things that I've seen managers do really well, those people that have that support their teams in ruthless prioritization. So if we all kind of manage this, I think, day to day in our jobs. We've got 1,000,001 things to do. We've got an endless to-do list of things that we're trying to achieve. Managers that can support their employees in sorting through that workload and nailing down on what those ruthless priorities are, whilst it might not necessarily reduce the workload, it helps you work with your employees to focus on the things that are most important to achieving business objectives, to achieving what it is that they're setting out to do. And that provides a level of support, and support is a control from a psychosocial risk management perspective. Having effective leadership and manager support is critical for employees in managing job demands and balancing that with the resources that they might have available. And I've seen managers who do that really, really well. It might be saying to an employee on a particular week, those 3 things are the most important things for this week. Let's focus on them only. And then let's pick up the rest of that list that we've got to get through once we've made some progress or some traction on those first 3 priorities. So that's a really easy strategy that actually doesn't cost anything. But it's about creating an environment where people feel safe enough and that it's okay to be transparent enough about the things that they might be challenged by.
Yeah.
And if that's a workload issue, they've got someone in their corner helping them work through that prioritization.
Yeah, it's so much more than just it being identifying workload or identifying the key priorities. It's more they're being heard. There's that connection piece. They're part of a team. They're doing it together. And when you look at all the data around that from a psychological point, that's why people stay with organizations, because they're connected. There's that connection piece. So managers doing that, there's so many different knock-on, because there's a genuine care factor there as well, which is what we all want, don't we? We want to be heard. We want to know that we matter and what we do matters as well.
100%. And to that point around equipping managers with the capability to identify psychosocial hazards and help implement controls, that provides them with the language and with the key messages for going out to their team and having conversations about things like workload and resources. It helps drive that sense of genuine care, because ultimately things like workload and resources, the way your job is designed, that all factors into how you're ultimately going to be feeling at work when you're at work, whether you feel like you can cope, whether you feel like you've got someone there behind you that has a genuine view.
Yeah, and has your back and is there to support you to perform, or your team to perform, rather than having someone like so many. And I don't think people do, I don't know, and we're not here to comment on whether people do it directly or not, or on purpose, but you just hear about as well people who don't have the right skill sets in terms of managing, and it does the exact opposite. And that's why organizations have the turnover that they have, and the cost that that they incur because of that as well, because of not having an engaged employees. So just talking about that as well, you spoke earlier about how you can do kind of like pulse surveys and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You should get your managers really to run it into, like, each individual manager to run it in their area to understand what's happening in their, they should be involved in it, to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think the consultation piece with respect to psychosocial risk assessment is so critical, and that means involving your managers in that process and feeding back to them the results, what you've actually identified in terms of potential hazards from a psychosocial risk perspective. And I mean, there's various different ways that you can conduct that type of assessment and gather the information that you might need, but critical to that is going to be consultation. So some businesses, like you said, will do pulse surveys that are designed specifically to look at psychosocial hazards. Other businesses, and it might be depending on size or geographic spread, I've seen some businesses do things like focus groups. So they're actually getting out with groups of employees, asking particular questions. The focus groups probably give you a little bit more insight into the particular question. So you could do a combination. You could do a survey in the first instance and then use your focus groups to nail down into what the specific issues are.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I wonder, obviously, because when you're doing surveys, I guess it depends on the culture of the organisation, but you can do them anonymously. So it'd just be interesting to kind of see the data captured from having anonymous surveys and then having focus groups as well, because you would need a pretty, I guess, engaged or disgruntled cohort of people in those focus groups to get to the bottom, because they either need to be really kind of happy and engaged to feel comfortable enough to share what they want to share, or on the other side of it, relatively annoyed enough to speak their mind as well.
I mean, if you set the context for your workforce around why you're actually conducting these activities and the fact that it's driven from a well-being, health and safety perspective and need, and that the purpose of doing that is about looking at what sorts of things might need to change, what sorts of controls could we implement as a business to address some of the issues that you're telling us about. And that's why we want to hear from people. But also, again, to put my risk and compliance hat back on, consultation is part of what's required from a health and safety legislative standpoint. So however you choose to engage with your workers, I think setting the context with them about why you're actually doing that is going to be critical, so that you're not promising necessarily to fix every particular issue that someone wants to raise or gripe about. It's coming at it from the perspective of, as a workforce, what are the main issues or challenges that have potential to cause harm or that have potential to cause a risk to your well-being, and then what do we need to do to address that? One area that's popping up a lot more at the moment, because we're getting up to December, and in December there'll be new powers for the Australian Human Rights Commission in terms of monitoring compliance with the new positive duty to eliminate sexual harassment and other forms of discriminatory conduct within the workplace. And this has all come out of huge reform that's happened following the Respect at Work inquiry that was held. But part of what's happening as a result of that and this new positive duty is businesses are now looking at, we need to conduct a risk assessment with respect to things like sexual harassment. And that's, I think, a new thing for lots of businesses. They're like, how do we actually do that? You can't do that without consulting and engaging with your workforce through doing things like conducting a survey, conducting focus groups, gathering that information somehow to tell you about what the lived experiences of your workforce are and the challenges that they're actually seeing, the sorts of issues that they come across in their day-to-day work that have potential to cause risk. And that's how you get the valuable information that you need to tailor the strategies that you're using for your workforce.
And I think, again, like, it depends on where you're at from an engagement piece with your workforce. And it might be that the first time you do it, you might not get as accurate data as what you would want. But I think the second time you do that, or the third time, as long as you're showing that you're actually, if you're trying to turn things around, that you're actually coming from a place of, we're trying our best here to figure out how to look after you and reduce this type of psychosocial risk piece.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get really nervous about the idea of going out to their workforce with a survey asking, are you experiencing sexual harassment? Are you experiencing bullying or occupational violence? Because businesses worry, well, once we have all this information, what do we then do with it? How do we actually address it? But I guess my view is, you have a responsibility to do something about that in any event. And if you don't have the information from your workforce about what's going on, how are you supposed to control those issues? Another way that I've seen clients do some of this consultation or engagement and gathering that information is actually building some questions into their usual pulse survey or engagement survey. So looking at that as a mechanism, because otherwise, we might be in a bit of survey fatigue. I think, lots of businesses are used to kind of sending out their usual engagement survey and they're worried, okay, well, add another survey on top of that. Are we going to get engagement and participation? So you might think about, well, if you're already conducting activities like an engagement survey, is there an opportunity to build some questions in that look at psychosocial risk factors or hazards that you might be able to gather some really helpful, useful information from?
Yeah, that's a nice way, I think, to start if you haven't previously kind of focused on this topic, which a lot of organisations and SMEs as well, it's probably something that they're having to invest more time in now, like we said. So how could businesses utilise flexible working arrangements as part of a wellbeing strategy?
Yeah, this is a good question. Yeah. I think flexible work arrangements have probably been overlooked somewhat in terms of the role that they can play as part of a wellbeing strategy. We've got a mechanism under the Fair Work Act that provides rights for particular groups of workers to make a request for flexible work arrangements. And if you look at those groups of workers that are protected under this mechanism, it's for people that have caring responsibilities, that might have a disability. We know that the usual sort of 9 to 5, go into the office every day world of work has changed, but also that type of working arrangement can work for particular types of people and absolutely not work for other people, like people with caring responsibilities, people with disabilities that ultimately can exponentially benefit from having more flexibility in the way that they work. I think the most important thing is, again, looking at your own workforce and what's going to work for you and your business, because
you have so many, like you have several different cohorts. So I think when we talk to organizations about this, or when we talk to leaders who are maybe a little bit reluctant to look at this, is because if you're looking at it just in terms of flexible work and not understanding that it's like a puzzle and the intricacies around it with how many pieces can be involved, it'll be like, well, it's not going to work because we've got a variety of different types of positions or responsibilities within our organisation, job responsibilities within our organisation. So it can be, well, we can't do it for one and not do it for the other, but it's flexible work can look differently depending on who you are and what your requirements are. So I think really you have to get down to that granular level and unpacking that. And once you do that a few times, it's not as overwhelming, and you find that it's actually, well, people should still realise the benefits of flexible working. And if you don't, then you just need to go out and read some of the recent reports that organisations are now sharing the data around how it drives engagement, how it increases work performance. It's not something to be scared of, and we definitely see in terms of the people that we help find jobs or we put into jobs, it's definitely, if it's not number one on their list of negotiables, it's not far behind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a matter of, exactly like you've said, understanding what's going to work best for your business, but then also kind of going one step down, what works, okay, for a particular team, for a particular person. And I think it's absolutely recognised. The majority of people, for example, won't be able to do their job at home
Yeah.
You know, we've got people that have to be in a particular workplace at particular times to get their work done. And remote work, as one example of a flexible work arrangement, is not going to work for everyone. But there might be other things that could work really well for your type of workforce. I've seen different types of arrangements across probably more traditional type roles that you wouldn't expect would, you know, be able to work flexibly or remotely. And they've come about as a result of a company or a business or a manager having a conversation and genuinely looking at what options have we got here.
How can we do this?
Yeah.
And I think so when we speak to leaders, I think some of the things that we hear is that they're worried about output, but flexible work doesn't mean changing the rules around the requirements. Like the output still needs to be there. It's not you have flexible work and therefore the output's reduced. Flexible work increases output. For the right people, it does, because people feel heard, they feel seen, they can do their job and then also have their life as well, which it could be whether it's caring for someone, whether it's having a family, whether it's not, whether it's other, depending on what stage you are in your life, obviously it changes, doesn't it? So having that support from an employer does not decrease output. And if it does decrease output, then you're looking at someone who potentially is unengaged and maybe they're not enjoying their role, or it's not a way of having to retain people if they're not performing. But if you do flexible work right, people should perform more and stay engaged, and you should retain them, and they will feel seen and valued as an employee.
Yeah, I think it's very obvious to me sometimes when I'm working with a business where it's not necessarily recognized that flexible work is actually part of a wellbeing strategy, as opposed to sort of sitting separate to that. I think maybe historically flexible work arrangements have been seen as this thing that the law makes us make that sort of arrangement, or ability for someone to request that sort of arrangement. It creates that. The law says we have to do it. And what's become more and more clear is that businesses that look at utilizing flexible work arrangements or a flexible work strategy as part of their well-being strategy, one, it sends a message to workers that we actually see this as being part of making sure that our workforce can be at their best, can show up as their best, manage their life, like you've said. But also I think it broadens perhaps how we might have traditionally viewed flexible work arrangements. So in the past, maybe it's been seen as, only working part-time instead of full-time, or, having a later start so you can do a school drop-off. But I think flexible work arrangements are actually we're seeing they're so much more broad than that. And when it's done well, I think part of the reason why it can be done really well is when, again, going back to managers and manager capability and understanding, when managers are able to actually engage openly and transparently with someone about, hey, what do you need? This is, what you've asked for. Maybe that won't exactly work. We don't know that we can make that work, but let's talk about options. Let's talk about what we potentially could do, and engaging in that dialogue, as opposed to it being you've made a request, it either gets approved or declined. Actually engaging in the conversation and having the two-way dialogue around what options there might be.
And you need to. That's what you need to do, because it's not a set process. It's a discovery. Like for each manager, they're going to have to go through, I guess, a discovery process. So when you think about that, we can, I know you and I both love a process. So we can actually create this as a process, but it's a discovery process to understand what it is individually. And even if you can't meet those needs in terms of the job function, it can't be performed to the level of what's required with what the employee is requesting. The fact that you're having those conversations with the employee is going to build that relationship and build that engagement, because you're actually sitting down and saying, okay, well, what's important to you? Because when you're at work, you come in and obviously you're paid and this is your job, but it's also you commit and you're delivering at this level, and we appreciate it. We want to keep you delivering at this level as well. So how can we do that so you can do your job and live a life as well? Because I think if you look back 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, however long it was, in terms of having like even with families, in terms of having both the mother and father working, back then it was predominantly men would go to work and women would stay at home because of the cost financially. You could do that. That doesn't happen anymore. So the amount of working parents that you see on both sides with children in childcare, that there needs to be for them some type of flexibility so they can go to work as well and contribute to the workforce, and also be able to perform their duties as a parents, because when they get home, they're not off the clock. There's no parent there that's sitting there interviewing. If anything, it's actually, I don't want to say, it's actually coming to work as a parent now. I really enjoy my work because I get to speak with adults and I get to do what I plan on doing and have my agenda for the day. Whereas when you're parenting, that regularly doesn't go as planned, because you might like to think that you're in control of your child, but really they've got other plans. So
yeah. I mean, I don't have kids myself, but I have worked as a manager with people in my team that have either become new parents or have little ones, multiple little ones that they're taking care of. And the way that I've tackled these sorts of conversations and offering flexibility, one, I think the clarity and the communication is so critical in terms of even going back to our previous points, that ruthless prioritization. Like, what are the things that are really important that we need to get done as a team or as a business? And this is what I can do in terms of supporting you to help you manage your working life and your home and family life. And I have ultimately seen that when my team are empowered to do what's best for them, work out what's best for them, they're showing up at work as their best self. They're delivering their best work because they're not feeling stressed and worried about having to call up and tell me I've got to take a whole day off now because I've got to run around to appointments. I've trusted that, hey, you do what you need to do to make that work for you. When you need help, when you need my support, reach out and we can work that out. But look, I know it's not possible for every job. I've got clients that work in transport and logistics. A truck driver can't work from home, you know, but I think there are some things that businesses can look at in terms of how do we help our teams, whether it's in the types of rostering that we do, whether it's in making sure people have enough time for a break, and that we're looking at things like burnout and fatigue, or at certain points in time in people's lives as well. So,
looking more holistically as well. And you know, it's not all about, so obviously when I talk about it, I'm definitely going to talk about it from being a parent because that's the phase that I'm in now. But I think about prior to having kids, and in terms of how I could work, I could come into the office and I could work 10 hours a day and I could push that work out. And I could perform at a really good level as long as I could kind of work out and do the other things that I like to do. But it doesn't mean that if you don't have a family, or if you're not caring for someone, that organisations can't, they should be able to put together something for these individuals as well who are really high performers. Maybe it might be that you look at a 9-day fortnight or a 4-day week that's really 5 days, because you still have the output. So I think the thing is about having that output. But kind of going back to what you were saying before, I think when you trust your employees to manage their time, then they trust back, and then that's where that's where you get that I guess great position that organisations want to be in, where they're retaining their employees and they're getting the output and the organisation is performing. Like, really, that's the kind of the key things that that you kind of measure. And if does it matter how you get there? Like, if everyone is feeling engaged and performing and the business is being successful, what is wrong with how you've created that?
Yeah, agree.
All right. And just lastly, what other considerations might there be when developing a wellbeing program?
So I think we've talked a lot about the psychosocial risks and managing those sorts of issues effectively, implementing appropriate controls. I think there are other data sets or information that businesses can look at in terms of understanding what might work best from a wellbeing program perspective for their particular workforce. So 2 points of data that I would typically suggest a business or a manager looks at are things like your injury data. So that might be looking at your workers' comp claims, the nature of those claims, what are they arising out of? And lots of businesses have really great processes in place to be looking at that information regularly. Another area that you might want to look at, and keeping in mind that it may not tell the whole picture, but looking at things like your complaints, grievance data, ER case management information. Those issues, when they're being reported and you can track and monitor your the types of complaints that you're getting, what the grievances are about, what your ER issues are about, paint a picture, a certain picture. Important to note, though.
To say before that, if you're a smaller organisation and you don't have a HRIS, you can still record these in a spreadsheet.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think keeping an eye on the trends and the themes that are arising, particularly out of the injury space, because that's going to be the kind of pointy end of things. And typically what that's going to be telling you is that there's something else going along or that's happened along the way that's driven the issue to this point. But it's really important to understand, particularly with ER issues or complaints data, it's only telling you one part of the story, because we know a lot of the time, particularly when it comes to things like harassment, bullying, those sorts of cultural or organizational environment issues, employees can feel really hesitant about reporting issues like that. So you may not necessarily be getting the entire picture from that data, but at least it's telling you something. And if you've got to
go further on that, so you can kind of scratch a little bit further to find out what's below the surface there, if you did find that trend.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that you want to dig into, because the data points are only telling you, again, one part of the story. What can be really helpful is that consultation piece that we've spoken about already. So as a bigger business, it might be running a survey or having the focus groups. For smaller businesses, just going out and talking to your people, having the conversations with your staff that are either managers or your employees that are there day to day, dealing with your customers, your clients, the workload, talking to them and gathering information about what's working well and what's not, and what they actually might benefit from a wellbeing perspective, is really helpful, really easy way to gather data. You don't need to do fancy surveys. I mean, the surveys are great because they anonymize things and potentially provide a platform where people feel a little bit safer to share thoughts. But I think even if you're doing something, sorry,
you go. I think you could have your managers. So say if you don't have the budget with that for surveys, or you don't have that HRIS system that can pull that data, even just having your managers, you can agree upon, I guess, speak to your managers to understand what they think is happening within their business unit, and you can agree upon sending your managers out and each kind of having some agreed questions that you're going to ask that you think would be relevant, and obviously asking employees as well. to contribute, but then you can get a general kind of run of, all right, well, these are the types of, have you come back and speak with your managers, these are the general types of highlighted key areas that are coming up again, and then you can kind of use that as a basis just to start. So it doesn't need to be all sophisticated to start off with. It just, I think you need to start.
Yeah, 100%. Just having the conversation and taking those visible steps. When people within your business see that this is a priority, see that it's something that you are asking questions about or that you want more information about, I think that sends a really strong message to people that, hey, this is important. You know, you're exactly.
But I think on the flip side of that as well, just before, if you kind of are just thinking about, okay, well, we need to go out and they're talking about psychosocial risk and all the cost to organisations, and this is going to be something that we need to obviously start looking into and get more serious about. You also, the flip side of that is, don't go out to your organisation and ask these questions and then not have a plan of then implementing something, because you can't go out and ask for contributions to understand what's happening in the business, to obviously make improvements for the better, and then turn around and sit on that data,
not
because
do anything.
that will only exacerbate the situation. So if your engagement isn't fantastic now and you go and do something like that, I have never seen it end well. If anything, it just to increase that disengagement, because you've got people to spend their time and actually open up about something. And it also highlights to your employees, actually, this is an issue. But do you know what? Where it looks like our employer now is starting to look at this and they're going to make improvements on it. And then you sit on that data, people will leave your organisation.
Yeah, agree. And I think we've spoken about some of the things that you can do without necessarily spending a whole bunch of money. So looking at your framework and at least the policies or processes that you've got in place, are they clear? That's a really important one. So people have an opportunity to go back to resources within the business and get some clarity around what support's available, how certain issues might be managed. Looking at things like your flexible work arrangements or policies and practices and how that's working, making sure you've got support for your managers in terms of dealing with people coming back to work after sick leave absences, or when they're dealing with a chronic illness or injury. Those things don't necessarily cost money, but they're about getting a level of structure and transparency in the way certain things are being managed. The other thing, I guess, that I think is just, I mean, it comes up again and again, so I sound like a bit of a broken record, but just with respect to your manager capability, I don't think that there is a better investment that you can make than in your managers and in the ongoing conversations, development, resources, allowing the time and a level of time and space for people that are managing people within your business to reflect on certain management practices, to be involved in looking at some of these wellbeing challenges or initiatives, to upskill themselves in terms of how they might handle particularly tricky situations or difficult scenarios with particular employees. Your managers are fundamental to that, are critical to that. And for smaller businesses where an owner or a director is the manager, again, you can't do anything better, I don't think, than investing the time in understanding and learning more about how you might be able to influence and have an impact on well-being through some of the things that we've spoken about. So I can't stress that enough. Your managers are the people that are managing your people, supporting your people. They are critical to driving that well-being within your workforce.
The knock-on effect of great managers is really having engaged, performing employees. Like, it's
absolutely
that simple. So people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. So
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on again. I always
My
love
pleasure.
having conversations with you around these types of topics, such as employee wellbeing and employee relations and absenteeism.
No, thanks, Bianca. It's nice to talk to you again. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.
All right.